Milwaukee Road was an 1850s pioneer in the Midwest and later famous for its fast trains, all-welded freight and passenger cars, home-built locomotives, and bankruptcies. And while it existed, the Milwaukee Road carried the respect and affection of the residents in the Prairie States. In his Kalmbach-published book, Milwaukee Road Remembered, former public relations executive Jen Scribbins points out that in 1931, the Milwaukee Road began to study the possibilities of passenger car weight reduction and improvements in passenger comfort. The all-welded steel cars pulled by streamlined Atlantics or Hudsons were spectacular, prompting other roads to streamline their steam trains. During the Granger years, the Milwaukee was forced by states to carry freight at less than cost. This and other problems led to several bankruptcies. Nevertheless, it always was a pioneer and leader in the industry. Unfortunately, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific was the last of the major lines out of Chicago to reach the West Coast. Despite the fact that it pioneered heavy electric power through the mountains, it tended to be a bridge road and developed little in the way of local origination on its West Coast extension. As Scribbins writes, the Milwaukee Road always seemed to be struggling for prosperity and never achieving it. On January 1st of 1986, the Sioux Line merged with the Milwaukee, ending a tremendous chapter in railroad history.
Not yet in existence when the Grange movement was most active in the 1870s was the Chicago Great Western. It was obsessed with establishing both predictable and equitable schedules and rates. According to H. Roger Grant's book, The Corn Belt Route, its large competitors could wage ruinous rate wars against the Great Western. So, A.B. Stickney, founder of the road, was certainly in favor of the control legislation brought about by the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. The Chicago Great Western eventually merged with the Chicago and Northwestern. Noted traction authority George Crandall's tells how important the Iowa interurban lines were to the Granger roads.
The Great Western Railway was particularly friendly to the interurban lines in the sense that they saw them as a very valuable potential feeder, and they encouraged them in every way they could. That's true on the Waterloo Cedar Falls in Northern, where the Great Western helped them by providing part of the line for them to run over, and on the Fort Dodge line, where they introduced rate systems with through the Interstate Commerce Commission that were favorable to the handling of freight through from the interurban to the mainline railroads. So the Great Western did its thing. The Des Moines and Central Iowa was one of the small interurban systems that was very important in freight activity. Starting way back about 1904, they got their first locomotive, and they interchanged with the Rock Island at Colfax, Iowa. They interchanged with the Milwaukee Road up at Prairie and Marana. And they lasted well after the war, because during the war, one of the camps was opened up on their line, and they had a lot of passengers and freight in connection with that. Most of these lines are gone, but little bits of the Des Moines and Central Iowa and the Fort Dodge are still operated today by the great former Northwestern system, which is today Uncle Pete's. But the Iowa lines were really an integral part of the Granger State's railroad activities.
The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy was the epitome of a Granger road, primarily because it began life so early and spread westward from Chicago, using Eastern Capital to build its own tracks and then absorb literally dozens of smaller lines. In the popular view of the Burlington, its most famous event was the dawn-to-dusk run of the Pioneer Zephyr from Denver to the Chicago World's Fair of 1934. That was the first time any railroad had run a diesel train 1,000 miles without stopping. And it was the defining event for the beginning of dieselization on the nation's railroads. But this wasn't the only first on the railroad. From that day in 1849, when the Aurora Branch Railroad borrowed the Northwestern's Little Pioneer to make its first run, Burlington expanded and prospered. The Q, as it was often called, was among the first to carry what became the ubiquitous railway post office cars. From an open platform car in 1862, the Post Office Department used thousands of RPOs in its service. The Q's fast mail cars were painted white. In 1959, Burlington celebrated the 75th anniversary of Train 29, the Chicago to Council Bluffs Fast Mail, with a special train where members of the media, including this reporter, were aboard. In a series of articles in Trains magazine in 1955, longtime editor David P. Morgan wrote, "Physically, the Burlington is possessed of one of the best plants in the West." The Burlington ran on 8,800 miles of its own tracks beginning at Chicago. Its slogan, "Everywhere West," alluded to how traffic moved through its major interchange terminals at St. Paul, Denver, and Kansas City. The line between Chicago and Aurora, Illinois was heavily traveled, requiring 3 mainline tracks side by side. Here, besides the freights and the intercity passenger trains, it maintained a heavy commuter service, first in steam and then with diesel power. Although a Granger road serving agriculture of the country's midsection, it also carried large quantities of coal from southern Illinois. In 1901, James J. Hill bought the Burlington, seeing it as a well-run and prosperous road, which also gave him access to Chicago for his Great Northern and Northern Pacific. Then, in 1934, Hill's understudy, Ralph Budd, took over the Q, becoming something of a legend among railroad men during his 17 years as president. In 1945, Harry C. Murphy became president, filling the shoes of Ralph Budd. While Murphy loved the big steam power on the Burlington, it fell to him to oversee the transfer of power to the diesel. Today, the streamlined Zephyr fleet no longer flashes along the tracks of what now is the Burlington Northern Santa Fe.
So the Burlington became one of what has been termed the Hill Lines. The GN and NP also were prairie lines beginning in the Twin Cities and eventually arriving at the West Coast, becoming what has been termed transcontinentals. The NP was there first, but suffered financial problems, and Jim Hill, who micromanaged his Great Northern, was able to acquire the Northern Pacific. As we know, the Hill lines became the Burlington Northern and then became the BN Santa Fe. But in the heyday of the long-distance passenger trains, all 3 of Hill's lines produced top-rated passenger trains between Chicago and the West Coast.
In Frank Donovan's History of the Minneapolis and St. Louis, Mileposts on the Prairie, he details how the financial panic of 1873 played havoc with the Minnesota railroads. Bad as that was, it didn't have the impact that the anti-rail legislation brought about by the efforts of the Granges had. It was like a plague of grasshoppers for the railroads. Indeed, the Minnesota Railroad Law of 1874 caused Eastern capital to shy away from investing in Minnesota lines. Between 1873 and 1875, not a mile of new track was built in Minnesota, and all the lines were losing money. Like most major railroads, the Minneapolis and St. Louis produced public relations films. In one, which came out at the end of the steam era, the railroad's announcer praised first-generation diesels and the efficiency of the railroad.
Maintenance of way, which means keeping track and roadbed in good condition, is one of the biggest expenses on any railroad. Embankments must be kept at proper height, level and width of base. Ditches must be kept free of tall weeds, so water will drain off. Cracked and warped ties have to be replaced. Even rails, plates, and angle bars are damaged by corrosion and wear. Smoother, faster freight service depends upon good maintenance of way. In the past 10 years, the M and St. L rebuilt over 500 miles of mainline track with crushed rock ballast, grade A hardwood ties, and new rails.
Are you looking to attend one of the...
One reason for the M and St. L's value to shippers is that it occupies a tie-in position with many other railroads. It lies in the middle of the heartland of America. Numerous junction points make transfers to and from other lines speedy and efficient. No longer need shipments from far points destined for the Middle West be slowed down as they near their destination. When transfer is made to the M and St. L, shipments travel by fast freight all the way. These powerful, sleek diesels appear to haul these long trains with little effort. There's 4,000 horsepower in the 3 units. From that stock shed on the right, livestock is shipped to market via the M and St. L. At Keithsburg, Illinois, the M and St. L bridges the mighty Mississippi River. The Keithsburg Bridge, almost a mile in length, is a modern all-steel bridge of the truss type, equipped with a draw span to permit passage of boats. Our nation's railroads knit together our farms, villages, factories, and cities, forming one great productive machine. More than any other single factor, railroads have made possible the American way of life.
Among the top transportation historians is George Hilton, Professor Emeritus, the University of California at Los Angeles. To his credit, he has written an enviable list of rail and maritime books.
Well, the main thing to be said about the Granger railroads is that there were just too many of them. They had an enormous amount of redundant mileage. This follows from their origin. The Lincoln administration, for political reasons during the Civil War, wanting to end the Transcontinental Railroad in solid Union territory, decided to end it at Council Bluffs, Iowa, and trusted the private sector to build between Council Bluffs and Chicago. Well, it did that, but excessively, with 3 lines, the Chicago and Northwestern, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific, as it became, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. Now, they began pricing collusively and pooling